This rich, entitled CEO came up to my fence like he owned the whole damn mountain. "This is a restraining order," he screamed, his face so purple I thought he might stroke out on the spot. He got so close I could smell the cologne and panic on him. He jabbed the papers at my chest, screaming, his spit shitting my face. "You stay away from my family, you psycho vet. You hear me? Stay away." Then he did the bravest thing he was capable of. He threw the documents into the dirt at my feet like they were garbage, sprinted back to his shiny SUV, and sped off, engine howling. He didn't know I will be the only one who could save his family in this place. The place that doesn't care about signatures, money, or especially the men who think they can own it. This is a channel about life, justice, and redemption. I love reading your comments, so tell me what country or city you're tuning in from today, and don't forget to subscribe. This story has an incredible twist at the end that you don't want to miss. Let's dive right in. The axe came down like a verdict. Steel bit into frozen pine, spraying sharp splinters. The log shuddered and split cleanly. Elias did not grunt or pause. The axe rose and fell in a steady, ruthless rhythm. Up, down, crack. His breath smoked in the thin mountain air, his muscles moving with practiced economical force. This mountain was his fortress, and he maintained it. His cabin clung to the lower slopes of the Denali Range, a gray, weather-beaten box made from trees he'd felled himself. An American flag hung from a rough pole out front, its colors sun-bleached, its edges shredded by the wind. It was not politics. It was a line in the dirt. This was his land, his last legal square of earth inside the national park, his outpost. He stacked the wood in neat, tight rows, working with the same quiet precision that defined everything he did. Up here, Elias was a rumor, a man who had erased himself from the world below. But he had not been born a ghost. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and gun oil. A Winchester lay broken down on a plank table, its pots arranged in order. Elias cleaned it with calm, deliberate motions. Above the narrow bed, a single firefighter's helmet hung on the wall. Scorched, blistered, the smokejumper's logo half melted into the char. He had left it exactly as the fire had given it back. In a greasy toolbox under a shelf, a corner of purple and gold ribbon showed from under a pile of wrenches. A medal for bravery, crumpled and forgotten with the hardware. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on worn denim. Scout waited by the chopping block, a thick-furred husky shepherd mix, eyes bright, ears sharp. He was not listening to the forest, he was listening to the whine. A high, insect-like buzz drifted over the treetops. Elias's winter blue eyes searched once, then fixed on a sleek black quadcopter hovering just beyond his property line. Its camera lens stared back at him like a single, unblinking eye. He did not yell. He did not reach for the rifle. He looked straight at it and slowly raised his middle finger. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. He held the gesture, then turned his back and started along the edge of his land. Scout watched the drone ready to sound off as it crossed the invisible line. Elias walked his perimeter, eyes on the ground. Near an old game trail, the forest told him what he needed to know. Moss torn open, soil chewed into deep, heavy tire tracks. Not a lost tourist, a work vehicle, something big that had no business this far off the road. To most people, it would be nothing. To Elias, it was a wound in living earth and a sign. His jaw clenched. His code was simple. Leave me be, and I will leave you be. The drone. The tracks. Someone was testing that. Then a new sound rolled up from the valley, a low, grinding roar that vibrated in his boots before it reached his ears. Diesel engines. Steel scraping rock. The sound of men forcing a road into a place that didn't want one. He climbed to the bluff and listened. He still could not see them, but he could hear them tearing the valley open, building something, hauling their world up his mountain. Old heat flickered in his chest. The part of him that once ran toward fire, not away from it, wanted to go down there, to stop it before it started. But that man had died in a firestorm on another mountain. Elias spat dark tobacco into the dirt. He was done fighting. All he wanted now was to be left alone in the ruins of his own choices. He whistled low. Scout appeared at his side as if pulled by a string. Elias turned away from the noise, away from the unseen machines and the men behind them. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's go check the snares." He walked back into the trees, rifle on his shoulder, choosing, for now, to ignore the invasion clawing its way up from the valley. But the sound followed him through the timber, threaded into the wind. It did not sound like it would stop. His war wasn't over. It was just getting started. While Elias checked his snares for rabbits, Richard Sterling was selling a dream, a very, very expensive dream. Down in the valley, the source of the noise was not a single machine, but an orchestra of them. Excavators with hydraulic arms sculpted the earth. Generators hummed a constant, low-frequency tune. And at the center of it all stood Richard, a man who looked profoundly out of place in the Alaskan wilderness. He wore a brand-new $1,000 Arc'teryx jacket in a color called magma that stood out against the green and brown landscape like a chemical spill. His boots were pristine. He gestured with a sweeping, magnanimous arm towards the half-finished project. "Gentlemen, This is not a resort. It is a curated experience. This is the Aurora Lodge. His audience, a trio of investors in equally clean, expensive gear, nodded along, their faces a mixture of awe and avarice. Before them, rising from the scarred earth, were the skeletons of what would become geodesic domes. Their frames were sleek, matte black aluminum, designed to hold vast panes of triple-glazed, heated glass. Each skypod, Richard continued, his voice echoing with the practiced confidence of 100 TED Talks, offers a 270-degree, uninterrupted view of the Aurora Borealis. Heated floors, an AI-driven concierge service, Michelin star meal kits delivered by drone, and a Starlink connection faster than you get in downtown San Francisco. We aren't just putting our guests in nature. We are giving them control over it. The wild, but with a 5-star user interface. He led them towards the main lodge, a sprawling structure of steel, glass, and cosmetically distressed wood. Security is paramount. The entire perimeter is fenced, low-voltage electric deterrent, thermal imaging cameras, motion sensors, all monitored 24/7 by our on-site team. He nodded towards a tough-looking man in a tactical vest standing by a Polaris ATV. Hansen, our head of security, former Anchorage PD. Hansen gave a curt, professional nod. It was Richard's wife, Sarah, who broke the spell of the sales pitch. She stood slightly apart from the group, her expression more thoughtful, less enthralled. She pulled her worn parka tighter, her eyes not on the architectural plans, but on the mountains themselves. Her gaze drifted upwards, following a thin, persistent wisp of wood smoke that curled into the crisp air from a distant ridge. "Richard," she said softly, "what about that?" Richard followed her gaze. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ah, that." He waved a dismissive hand. "An old squatter. Got himself a grandfathered parcel before the park expanded. A non-issue." One of the investors frowned. "Is he close?" "Geographically, yes." "In every other sense, he's on another planet," Richard scoffed. "Some stubborn old redneck who thinks the 1880s were the peak of civilization. My legal team in Seattle is handling it. We've made him a very generous offer. He'll sell. They always do." Sarah didn't look convinced. She had seen the man once, from a distance. A silhouette of a man moving through the trees with an ease and silence that made their own noisy presence feel like an intrusion. He didn't look like a man who was interested in generous offers. Up on that ridge, Elias had seen them long before Sarah had seen his smoke. The garish orange jacket was an insult to the landscape. He lay flat on a bed of pine needles, Scout silent at his side, his old military-grade binoculars pressed to his eyes. He wasn't spying. He was observing, the way a hawk observes a clutch of clumsy field mice. He watched the man in the orange jacket wave his arms, his mouth moving, selling his poison. He saw the others nodding, their posture soft and urban. They pointed at maps. They pointed at the sky. They were carving up his silence, packaging it, putting a price tag on it. They were tourists not just to the land, but to the reality of it. They saw a pretty picture. He saw a place that could kill you in a dozen different ways if you stopped paying attention for 5 minutes. And then, for a brief second, his binoculars found the woman, Sarah. She wasn't looking at the man in orange. She was looking right back up at the ridge. She couldn't see him, not really, but she was looking at his home. There was something different in her face. Not greed, not ambition, something else. Worry. Then the man in orange turned. The sun climbing over the peak of the mountain hit the lens of Elias's binoculars. For a fraction of a second, a brilliant star of light flared on the ridge. Down below, Richard recoiled as if he'd been struck. What the hell was that? He squinted, shielding his eyes. Up there, on the ridge. Did you see that? Hansen, the security chief, had already raised his own tactical monocular. A glint. Could be anything. A piece of quartz, ice, or it could be him, Richard snapped, his voice losing its smooth salesman's charm and taking on a hard, ugly edge. It's that damn squatter. He's watching us. The idea was offensive to him. A violation. The thought that someone, some nobody, was peering into his multi-million-dollar venture from a filthy shack was intolerable. His private world, his curated experience, was being contaminated. Get on the radio, Richard commanded Hansen. I want to know who that is. What's his name? Does he have a record? His name is Elias Thorne, Hansen said, not lowering his monocular. No local record. Property's legit. Served in the Forest Service, they say. Elite crew. Smokejumper. The word hung in the air. Richard just stared. A firefighter? Who cares? He's trespassing with his eyes. This is a private development. Our guests, our investors, require absolute privacy and security. He turned to Hansen, his face set like concrete. The veneer of the visionary tech CEO had vanished, replaced by a ruthless landlord. I want patrols running the perimeter, day and night, he ordered. I want our drones making sweeps up that ridge every hour. Let him know he's being watched back. Make his life uncomfortable. Find something we can use. Anything. The first guests of the Aurora Lodge arrived like an invading army. The low hum of generators was now buried under the high-pitched whine of brand-new snowmobiles and the guttural roar of ATVs. Men in bright ski gear, worth more than most cars, carved ugly brown scars into the pristine snow, laughing as they churned up mud and moss. They were buying the wilderness experience, and they wanted to hear its engine. Up on his ridge, Elias heard the noise not as a sound, but as a sickness. It was a fever in the valley. Scout, lying by the unlit wood stove, let out a low growl, his ears twitching with every rev of an engine. "Easy, boy," Elias muttered, running a hand over the dog's thick coat. "Fools in a playground. They'll get tired soon." But they didn't. The noise was constant. Later that afternoon, Elias was splitting logs when Scout suddenly went rigid. His head snapped towards the tree line, a statue of muscle and fur. A flash of white, a snowshoe hare in its winter coat bolted from the undergrowth. Instinct, pure and undeniable, took over. Scout was a blur, launching himself from the porch and streaking across the clearing after the hare. "Scout, heel!" Elias's voice was a sharp crack in the air, but the chase was on. The dog was poetry in motion, a grey and white streak against the snow weaving through the birch trees. The hare, desperate, zigzagged towards the valley, towards the fence line of the Aurora Lodge. Scout didn't see a fence. He saw only the chase. He cleared the low-slung, high-tech barrier in a single, effortless leap, landing softly on the manicured grounds of the resort. The hare vanished into a meticulously planted shrub. Scout, panting happily, began sniffing around the bush, his tail wagging. He had arrived in another world. A young security guard, no older than 20, saw the whole thing from his post near the main lodge. His eyes went wide. This was his chance to prove himself to Hansen, to Mr. Sterling, an intruder, a wild animal on the property. He unholstered the weapon on his hip, not a pistol, but a bulky orange taser shotgun. He fumbled with it, his movements clumsy with adrenaline. "Get away from there." "Get back," he shouted, his voice cracking. Scout looked up, confused by the shouting. He took a tentative step towards the guard, tail still wagging, a friendly gesture. The guard panicked. He raised the weapon. "I said, get back." Last warning. The sound of him racking the weapon, loading a cartridge into the chamber, was unnaturally loud in the cold air. A few of the VIP guests, sipping hot toddies on the deck of the main lodge, turned to watch the unfolding drama with mild amusement. Just as the god's finger tautened on the trigger, a voice, quiet as a falling leaf but heavy as a boulder, came from the edge of the woods. "Put it down, son." Elias was just there. He hadn't made a sound. He stood at the tree line, not 50 feet away, his old Winchester rifle resting comfortably on his shoulder. He wasn't aiming it. He didn't have to. Its mere presence changed the gravity of the situation. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the young guard. The guard froze, his face pale. This is private property. That animal is a threat. He's a dog chasing a rabbit," Elias said, his voice never rising. "And you're about to make a very stupid mistake. Put the weapon down. Now." The back door of the lodge burst open and Richard Sterling stormed out, his face flushed with rage. He was followed by Hansen, his security chief. "What in God's name is going on here?" Richard bellowed, his eyes locking onto Elias. "You, I knew it. You're trespassing, and you're armed." "I'm calling the sheriff." He pulled out a satellite phone, his fingers jabbing at the keypad. The guests on the deck leaned forward, enjoying the show. Elias ignored him completely. His gaze remained on the young guard. "Last time I'm going to tell you, son." The guard, caught between two fires, slowly lowered the taser shotgun. Richard saw this and his fury intensified. "Don't you listen to him. He's a nobody. Just some psychotic veteran with a PTSD complex who thinks he owns the mountain." The insult was designed to sting, to diminish Elias in front of his audience. Elias's eyes finally shifted from the guard to Richard. There was no anger in them, only a profound, weary contempt. He gave a short, sharp whistle. Instantly, Scout abandoned his search for the rabbit, trotted to Elias's side, and sat, looking up at him expectantly. The display of perfect obedience was a stark contrast to the chaotic scene. Elias turned his attention back to Richard. "Your fence," he said, his voice flat and even. "You built it straight across the spring migration trail. The Denali elk herd has used that route for 1,000 years. Blocking it is a federal violation. The Park Service might be interested to know about that." Richard stared, momentarily speechless. He knew nothing of migration trails. He had seen a flat, buildable piece of land on a map. The idea that animals had their own ancient highways was absurd to him. That's a lie," he stammered, regaining his footing. "You're trying to intimidate me." Elias didn't bother to reply. He gave Richard one last dismissive look, a look that said he wasn't worth the breath. He turned, and with Scout trotting silently at his heel, melted back into the shadows of the forest. He was gone as quickly as he had appeared. For a moment there was silence. The guests on the deck were murmuring. Richard's face was a mask of purple rage. He had been challenged and dismissed on his own property in front of his clients. The redneck hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. He had simply shown up, taken back his dog, pointed out a flaw in Richard's perfect world, and left. It was an intolerable humiliation. Richard whirled on the young guard. "You're fired. Get off my property." Then he turned to Hansen. "I told you to handle him." He raised the satellite phone to his ear, his voice trembling with fury as he spoke to the dispatcher on the other end. "Yes, Sheriff's Department?" "This is Richard Sterling at the Aurora Lodge. I want to report a man. An Elias Thorne. He came onto my property armed and threatening. My guest's lives were in danger." He paused, listening. "No, I don't want a deputy to just talk to him. I want a file opened. I want him dealt with. I want a restraining order. I want that man gone." Summer came to the mountains not as a guest but as an invader. A blistering, unprecedented heat wave settled over the Denali foothills, leaching the color from the world. The vibrant green of the spruces faded to a dusty olive. The moss that covered the forest floor turned brown and crunchy underfoot, like ancient parchment. The air was thin and brittle. To breathe it in felt like inhaling dust. Down in the valley, Richard Sterling saw the hate as a marketing opportunity. The Alaskan Riviera, he called it to his wealthy guests, who lounged by a newly installed infinity pool, its chlorinated blue an obscene slash against the parched landscape. He walked the perimeter of his resort with a potential investor, a man in a linen suit that was already wilting. "Every contingency is accounted for," Richard said, gesturing with a proprietary sweep of his hand. "This isn't just a resort, it's a smart fortress. See those small domes on the roofs?" He pointed to a series of discrete black half-spheres, thermal sensors. The moment they detect a temperature spike outside of normal parameters, they trigger the automated sprinkler system. We can douse the entire property in fire-retardant foam in under 90 seconds. The investor nodded, impressed. "And power? A fire could knock out the grid." "Triple redundant," Richard said with a smug smile. "If the main line goes, 2 diesel generators kick in automatically. They can power this entire place for a week. And every door, every window is on a smart lock system. At the first sign of a security or environmental threat, I can seal the entire compound with a single tap on my phone. Nothing gets in. Nothing gets out." He was proud of that last part. It spoke of absolute control, the kind of control that money was supposed to buy. He had built a bubble of technology in the heart of the wild, and he believed it was impenetrable. Up on his ridge, Elias felt the heat in his bones. The sun was a hammer, and the land was the anvil. He didn't need thermal sensors to know the danger. He could smell it in the air. The scent of superheated pine resin, a forest turning itself into kindling. He spent his days not lounging, but working, with a tool that looked like a medieval weapon. A Pulaski, with an axe blade on one side and a wide hoe on the other, he began to carve a ring around his cabin. It was brutal, sweat-soaked labor. He swung the axe end to chop through the roots and stubborn brush, then flipped it to use the hoe, scraping away the dry carpet of needles, leaves, and moss. He worked until he exposed a 10-foot-wide belt of bare, dark earth. A fire break. A scar on the land made to save himself. It was an old technique, something he'd learned decades ago, something that worked without electricity or Wi-Fi. As he worked, his gaze would drift down to the Aurora Lodge. Through his binoculars, the glass domes glittered like the eyes of some huge sleeping insect. He saw the single, winding road that led to the highway, a narrow asphalt ribbon hemmed in on both sides by a thick, combustible forest. He saw the generator sheds, with their air intakes facing the driest part of the valley. He saw the walls of glass on the main lodge. And he understood the flaw. It wasn't just a flaw, it was a fatal design. Richard's smart locks would seal everyone inside, but when the diesel generators, starved for clean air, choked on smoke and ash and inevitably failed, those same smart locks would become their tombs. The power wouldn't just be out, the system would fail secure, locked tight. The narrow road, their only escape, would be blocked by a single falling, burning tree. Richard hadn't built a fortress, he'd built a kiln. Sarah felt it too, a primal anxiety that the air conditioning and chilled cocktails couldn't soothe. She watched the staff nervously watering the decorative lawns, the water evaporating almost as soon as it hit the ground. She looked up at the ridge, at the lone plume of smoke rising from the chimney of the old cabin. That evening, she found Richard in his office, looking over stock portfolios on a glowing screen. "Richard," she began, her voice hesitant, "I'm worried about the fire risk. Everything is so dry." "It's being handled, honey," he said, not looking up from his monitor. "The systems are all green. But that man," she pressed on, "our neighbor, Elias, he's lived here his whole life. He must know these mountains, know what this kind of heat means. Maybe you should talk to him." Richard finally looked up, his expression one of pure condescension. He swiveled in his chair and took her hand, patting it as if she were a fretful child. "Sarah, darling, what is he going to tell me? To pray for rain? We have a $500,000 fire suppression system. He has a shovel. We are insured for $100 million. And we have a helipad that can get us, Lily, and our most important clients out of here in 20 minutes. We are safer here than anywhere on earth." His confidence was absolute, a wall she couldn't possibly scale. She withdrew her hand, a cold dread seeping into her heart. He didn't see the land, he only saw the assets. Elias finished the last section of his fire break as the sun began to set, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red. He stood, leaning on the handle of the Pulaski, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his back screaming in protest. He looked at his small, defensible cabin, surrounded by a moat of black dirt. Then he looked down at the glittering resort in the valley. He thought about walking down there, about trying to warn them. But then he remembered Richard's face, contorted with rage. He remembered the words spat at him like venom, psychotic veteran, PTSD case. He remembered the threat of a restraining order, the promise to have him thrown in jail. You don't offer a hand to a man who has promised to bite it off. They had made their choice. They had chosen their fortress of glass and wires over the wisdom of the mountain. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Let the fool drown in his 5-star puddle, he muttered to Scout, who sat panting faithfully by his side. He turned his back on the valley and went inside to clean his tools. Later that night, the oppressive heat didn't break. Instead, the air grew thick, heavy, carrying the sharp metallic tang of a coming storm. The wind, which had whispered through the trees all day, died completely. An unnatural silence fell over the mountains, so profound that Elias could hear the beat of his own heart. He stood on his porch, watching the sky. In the far distance, over the next ridge, the clouds began to flicker with a pale, eerie light. There was no thunder, no sound at all, just silent, ghostly flashes that illuminated the angry belly of the sky. He knew that light. It wasn't the blessed relief of a summer rainstorm. It was something far more sinister. Dry lightning. It was a match, searching for a fuse. And the whole world around him was the fuse. The Aurora Lodge was a gilded cage, and at 10 years old, Lily Sterling was already an expert on its bars. The infinity pool was just chlorinated water. The egg-kite television was just colored lots. The 5-star meals all started to taste the same. From the floor-to-ceiling window of her suite, she could see the real world, the dark, beckoning line of the forest, a place that smelled of dirt and secrets, not air freshener and money. Her father called it the perimeter. To Lily, it was the edge of the world. She watched a supply truck rumble out of a service gate, the heavy steel barrier sliding shut slowly behind it. But it paused for a second, just before it locked. A beat, a hesitation in the machine. It was enough. Slipping on a pair of sneakers, she moved with a quiet purpose that would have shocked her parents. She slipped through a staff corridor, past the hum of the laundry room, and out a side door. The heat hit her like a physical thing. The air was thick with the scent of hot pine needles. She ran, her feet light on the manicured grass, and squeezed through the gap in the service gate just as it clicked shut. She was free. The forest was a different world. The silence here wasn't empty, it was full. It was the buzz of insects, the rustle of some unseen thing in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the high branches. She followed a deer trail, her heart thumping with a mix of fear and exhilarating freedom. She found a patch of wild blueberries, staining her fingers and lips purple. She saw a raven, big as a cat, watching her with intelligent black eyes. This was real. Then she saw the footprint. It was pressed deep into a patch of damp earth near a stream, a perfect, terrifying shape armed with 5 crescent moon claws. It was bigger than her father's 2 hands put together. She froze, the sweet taste of blueberries turning to ash in her mouth. The stories the security guards told, the ones her father dismissed as campfire tales, flooded her mind. A grizzly. A twig snapped behind her. Lily spun around, her breath catching in her throat. He was just there, as if he had grown out of the ground like a tree. The man from the cabin on the hill, Elias. He wasn't tall and broad like her father's bodyguards. He was wiry, all tendon and bone, with a face carved from granite. He held a small dead rabbit by its ears in one hand and an old scarred rifle in the other. He looked from her wide eyes to the massive footprint, and his expression didn't change. "Don't scream," he said. His voice was quiet, rough like gravel. "Screaming sounds like something that's hurt, something easy to catch." Lily clamped her mouth shut, nodding, her eyes still fixed on him. He took a step closer, gesturing with his chin at the paw print. "You know what made that?" She whispered the word. "A bear. Grizzly. Big one. Moved through here maybe an hour ago." He looked around, his eyes scanning the trees, not with fear, but with an intense, analytical calm. He won't be back. Already found what he was looking for. He nudged a half-eaten salmon carcass on the creek bank with his boot. He looked back at her. "What do you do if you see one?" "Run," she said automatically. "It's what you did when you were scared." "No," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Running is what food does. You run, he'll chase you. It's a game to him, a game you lose." He unclipped a red can from his belt. "You ever seen one of these?" She shook her head. "Bear spray. It's not a toy." He held it out for her to see, but not to touch. "You stand your ground. You make yourself look big." He stood up a little taller, puffing out his chest in a way that would have looked silly on anyone else. "You shout at it. 'Hey, bear, get out of here, bear.' You let him know you're not a deer. You're a problem. This," he tapped the can, "is for when he decides to be a problem back. You spray it at his face. It won't kill him, but he'll wish it did." He clipped it back on his belt. The lesson was over. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You're the rich man's girl." It wasn't a question. She just nodded, feeling a little ashamed. Her eyes drifted to his arm. A web of old scars, pale and puckered, ran from his wrist up under the sleeve of his flannel shirt. They looked like a map of a place you'd never want to go. Without thinking, she asked, "What happened to your arm?" His face tightened just for a second. Work, he said, his voice flat. He turned to leave. What kind of work? She pressed, emboldened by his lack of anger. He paused, his back to her. I used to fight fire. Lily's eyes went wide. She'd seen a documentary about them once. Men who fell from the sky. Like with a parachute? A smoke jumper? He grunted, a sound that was half sigh, half confirmation. He didn't have to say more. In her mind, the image clicked into place. This wasn't just a scary mountain man. This was a superhero. A man who jumped in the fire. He seemed to feel her staring. He turned back, a strange look on his face. Something between annoyance and something else she couldn't name. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled something out. It was a military compass, old and brass, heavy in his palm. Your phone won't work out here, he said, pressing it into her hand. The metal was cool against her skin. The battery dies. You drop it in the creek. Satellites go down. But this always works. He tapped the glass face. The needle quivered, then settled, pointing north. See that peak? The one that looks like a broken tooth? She followed his gaze to the jagged mountain on the horizon. That's north. The creek always flows south, away from it. If you ever get turned around, if you ever get lost, don't go for the road. The road is a trap. You find the creek, and you follow it north. Understand? She clutched the compass, nodding solemnly. It felt like the most important secret in the world. A pact. North, she repeated. To the creek. He gave a final, curt nod. For a moment, a flicker of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, and it changed his whole face. Then it was gone. He turned and started walking back up the trail, his dog Scout materializing from the woods to trot at his heels. Lily watched him go, the heavy compass a reassuring weight in her hand. She felt safer than she ever had behind the electric fences and smart locks of her father's resort. She looked down at the compass, at the steady, unwavering needle. North. Lily! The voice was sharp, amplified. It cut through the forest peace like a siren. Lily spun around. Standing on the trail not 20 feet away was the head of her father's security team, a burly ex-cop named Miller. His hand was on the grip of the pistol holstered on his hip, and his eyes were cold as chips of ice. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring past her up the trail at the spot where Elias had just disappeared into the trees. Stay right there, Lily, Miller said into the radio on his shoulder. I have the asset. Then, his voice dropping, he added a single, venomous sentence meant only for his boss on the other end. And I've found your trespasser. The roar of the Polaris Ranger's engine was the sound of Richard Sterling's fury. It tore through the quiet of the Alaskan afternoon, a mechanical scream of outrage. He gunned the engine, sending gravel spitting from under the tires as he raced along the service road that bordered his property. In the passenger seat, Sarah braced herself against the dashboard, her knuckles white. He gave her a compass, Richard. He was teaching her how to survive if she got lost, she said, her voice strained over the engine's whine. He was grooming her, Richard snapped, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. Miller's radio call had lit a fuse in his brain. Trespasser. Asset. Contact. It was corporate security speak, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. His daughter, his 10-year-old Lily, alone in the woods with that hermit. That's what they do. Predators. They find a vulnerability. They offer a gift, a secret. They build trust. I've read the case studies. He's not a predator, he's a neighbor, Sarah pleaded. She said he fought fires. He was a hero. Richard let out a short, barking laugh. A hero? He's a PTSD case living in a shack, hoarding guns. He's a lawsuit waiting to happen. What if he'd hurt her? What if she fell? He's unstable, Sarah. Can't you see that? He pulled a satellite phone from its cradle on the dash. He didn't have to look up the number. Get me Henderson, he barked into the phone. Legal. Now. He swerved to avoid a pothole, not slowing down. Sarah flinched. Henderson? Richard Sterling. I want a restraining order. Temporary, ex parte, whatever you can get the fastest, yes. Against my neighbor, Elias Thorne. Threat to a minor, absolutely. He lured my daughter off property, I don't care how you frame it. Mention his military background. Suggest he's unstable. Paint the goddamn picture. I want him legally barred from coming within 500 yards of my family or my resort, and I want it by end of business today. He clicked the phone off and threw it back in the cradle. Problem solved. A legal order isn't a solution, Sarah said quietly. It's a declaration of war. Richard just smiled, a thin, humorless expression. Good. Let him bring it. They found Elias outside his cabin, his back to them. The rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood echoed in the small clearing. He was working his way through a massive pile of birch logs with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. Each swing was precise, powerful, economical. He didn't seem to notice the high-tech ATV that had parked just outside his simple split-rail fence. Scout, his husky shepherd mix, lifted his head from his paws, let out a low growl, but didn't move from his spot in the sun. Richard killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy. He swung himself out of the driver's seat, a sheaf of freshly printed papers in his hand, faxed from his lawyer in Anchorage to the resort's office. He strode to the fence line, his expensive hiking boots crunching on the dry ground. "Thorne!" he yelled. Elias finished his swing, the axe biting deep into a log and splitting it perfectly in two. He set the axe down deliberately, embedding its head in the chopping block. Only then did he turn. He didn't speak. He just watched, his face a mask of neutrality, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a scarred forearm. "This," Richard said, shaking the papers, "is a temporary restraining order, signed by a judge. It says you are to stay at least 500 yards away from my daughter, my wife, and my property line at all times." Elias's gaze flickered from Richard's face to Sarah, who remained in the ATV, watching with a look of pained apology. He looked back at Richard. Still, he said nothing. The silence seemed to infuriate Richard more than any argument could. "You think you can just lure a little girl into the woods? Give her trinkets? Fill her head with your survivalist nonsense?" Richard's voice rose, his face turning red. "You're a sick bastard, you know that? A psycho vet who couldn't cut it in the real world, so you came up here to prey on people." Elias's eyes narrowed just slightly. It was the only reaction he gave. "I saw your file," Richard spat, taking another step closer to the fence, as if it were a cage separating him from a dangerous animal. "Honorable discharge, my ass. They push guys like you out the back door with a medal and a pat on the head so you don't go postal on the base. I know your type." Sarah finally spoke, her voice timid. "Richard, stop it." He ignored her. "Let me make this crystal clear for you. If I see you, if one of my cameras sees you, if my daughter even mentions your name again, I won't call the sheriff. I'll call the U.S. Marshals. I will bury you in so much legal trouble you'll wish you'd stayed in whatever fire you crawled out of. I'll have you up on kidnapping charges, you understand me?" He waited, breathing heavily, practically vibrating with rage. He wanted a reaction, a denial, a threat, anything. Elias gave him nothing. He just stood there, solid as the mountains behind him, his silence a profound and unshakable judgment. Frustrated, Richard crumpled the top page of the order into a ball. He threw the whole stack of papers over the fence. They scattered in the dirt at Elias's feet. "Stay the hell away from my family," he snarled. He turned on his heel, stormed back to the Polaris, and fired up the engine with a deafening roar. He put it in gear and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and the quiet of the forest to settle back in its wake. Elias watched them go. He waited until the sound of the engine had completely faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pines. He walked over to the fence and bent down, his movements unhurried. He gathered the scattered pages, brushing the dirt from them with a calloused thumb. He saw the legal boilerplate, the official seals, the stark typed letters of his own name. He saw the words, posed as a credible threat, unstable, immediate, and irreparable harm. He straightened up and walked back toward his cabin, the papers held loosely in one hand. Scout got up and trotted alongside him, nudging his hand with a wet nose. Elias entered the cool, dark interior of the cabin. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. On the wall, the scorched smokejumper helmet hung like a memorial. He crossed to the cast-iron wood stove that dominated the main room. It radiated a gentle warmth. He opened the heavy door, revealing a bed of glowing orange and red coals. One by one, he took the pages of the restraining order. He didn't read them again. He knew what they were. They were a fence made of paper, a wall built of words. He fed the first page into the stove. The corner blackened instantly, then curled inward as the fire licked at the edges, consuming the legal jargon in a silent, hungry flame. He added another, and another. He saved the signature page for last. He held it for a moment, looking at the judge's scrawled name at the bottom. It meant nothing here. It was a symbol from a world he had left behind, a world of rules that didn't apply when the wind blew hard and the snow fell deep, a world that had just declared him an enemy. He pushed the final page into the fire. It caught, flared brightly for a second, then crumbled into a floating black wafer of ash. He closed the iron door with a soft final clang. The lock had been set, the line had been drawn, and he was on the other side of it. The voice from the weather radio was a machine, flat and without emotion, which made its message even more terrifying. A red flag warning is in effect. Extreme fire conditions are expected. A combination of strong winds, low relative humidity, and warm temperatures will create explosive fire growth potential. In his cabin, Elias Thorne listened. He stood by the window, looking out at a world bleached of color. The sky wasn't blue, it was a hazy, dusty yellow. The air felt heavy, like a wool blanket soaked in gasoline, just waiting for a spark. The pines on the ridge stood bone dry and motionless, holding their breath. Every instinct in his body, honed by years of walking into infernos, screamed that something was wrong. This wasn't just a hot day. This was a loaded gun. He was miles from his cabin, checking a line of snares near a game trail when Scout stopped dead. The dog's ruff bristled. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its chest. The air was suddenly thick with the coppery stench of death. Elias put a hand on Scout's neck, quieting him. He unslung the Winchester from his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dense brush. He found it 50 yards off the trail, a grizzly bear, or what was left of one. It was a massive creature, easily 700 pounds, but it had been butchered with a terrifying efficiency. The flies were a living, buzzing shroud over the carcass. The animal's massive paws had been hacked off. A crude slice ran down its belly where the gallbladder had been ripped out. This was no hunter. This was a slaughter for parts, for the black market. This was cartel work. Elias knelt, his face grim. He ignored the smell. He saw the bullet holes, tight groupings from a weapon on full auto. He ran a hand through the pine needles on the ground and his fingers closed around them. Not the heavy brass of a hunting rifle, but the smaller, lighter casings of military-style rounds. 5.56 millimeter. He rolled one between his thumb and forefinger. These people weren't here for sport. They were armed for war, and they were trespassing on his mountain. He stood up, leaving the dead bear to the flies. The fire wasn't the only monster in these woods. At the Aurora Lodge, the only fire was in the massive stone hearth of the main building, a controlled, picturesque blaze for ambiance. Outside, industrial-grade sprinklers hissed across a lawn so green it looked painted on, a defiant middle finger to the parched wilderness surrounding it. Richard Sterling held a flute of champagne, laughing at something a portly, red-faced man in a suit had said. The man was Senator Davies, and Richard's party was in full swing. Sarah watched from the edge of the patio. She felt a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. A member of the kitchen staff had rushed past her moments before, his face pale, muttering about the red flag warning on the radio. She approached her husband, keeping her voice low. "Richard, the staff is saying there's a severe fire warning. They're talking about evacuations in the lower valley." Richard didn't even look at her. He kept his smile fixed on the senator. "It's fine, honey. This place has a state-of-the-art fire suppression system. And the sprinklers are on. Don't spoil the mood." "But the news," she persisted, her voice barely a whisper. "They also mentioned poachers, a gang heavily armed. They found a bear." He finally glanced at her, his eyes cold and annoyed. "We have a dozen armed security guards on a closed perimeter. They can handle a few local yahoos with deer rifles. Now please, go talk to the senator's wife. You're making a scene." He turned his back on her, laughing again at another of the politician's jokes. Sarah stood there for a moment, invisible, her fear dismissed as a minor inconvenience. She looked past the party, past the electrified fence, to the silent, watching mountains. She felt like she was in a glass box and the walls were getting hotter. She couldn't stand it. Making an excuse about checking on Lily, she slipped away from the polished decks and manicured grass. She walked along the sterile gravel service road that ran the perimeter of the resort, the sound of the party fading behind her. The restraining order felt like a physical weight, but her fear was heavier. She reached the spot where Richard had thrown the pipers, the place where two worlds touched. "Elias," she called out, her voice thin in the oppressive quiet. "Elias, are you there?" For a moment there was nothing. Then he stepped out from between two ancient spruce trees, appearing as if he'd been born from the shadows. He wasn't holding a rifle, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. He stopped 10 feet from the fence, his face unreadable. Words tumbled out of her. "I'm sorry to bother you. I know I shouldn't be here. But the radio is saying Richard won't listen. He's having a party for a senator, and he told me not to worry, that the security can handle it." Elias's eyes flickered past her towards the distant sound of clinking glasses. He looked back at her, his gaze intense. He'd seen the bear. He'd found the casings. He knew Richard's hired guns weren't prepared for the kind of men who were now in these woods. "The security is for show," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "They're used to dealing with drunks and paparazzi." "Not this. What do I do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "He won't listen to me. He thinks I'm being hysterical." Elias didn't offer comforting lies. He gave her a mission. Go back to the lodge. Find a radio, a walkie-talkie, anything. Put it on Channel 9. Keep it with you. Don't turn it off. He paused, his eyes locking on hers. "Then you pack a bag, a small one, for you and for the girl. Water, canned food, things you don't have to cook, a first aid kit. Your warmest coats, even if it's hot. Wool socks. Put the bag somewhere you can grab them fast. By the back door, not the front." He gave her a final hard look. "Do it now." Before she could thank him, he stepped back and was gone, swallowed by the trees as silently as he had appeared. Sarah stood alone by the fence, her heart pounding. The fear was still there, but now it had a shape, and she had a plan. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the yellow haze in shades of orange and blood red, Elias returned to his cabin. The distant party was just a faint glimmer of light, a fragile island in a vast, dark sea. He walked past the woodpile, past the scorched helmet hanging on his wall. He knelt before a heavy steel footlocker bolted to the floorboards beneath his cot. He worked the combination lock, the tumblers clicking softly in the quiet room. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in foam, was not his familiar Winchester. This was something else. It was matte black, angular, and brutally efficient. An old M14 rifle, heavy and reliable, a relic from a different war. He lifted it out, its weight familiar in his hands. He worked the charging handle, the metallic clack-clack of the action echoing like a death sentence in the cabin. He picked up a full 20-round magazine, feeling the weight of the heavy 7.62 bullets inside. He slid it into the rifle's magazine well. It seated with a sharp, final click. He was no longer just a man in a cabin. He was a sentry at his post, and the enemy was closing in. The thunder came first, a dry, hollow cough from a sick sky. There was no rain. Elias Thorne stood on his porch, the heavy M14 held loosely in one hand, and tasted the air. Ozone. The world held its breath, the silence between the heartbeats of the storm stretching into an unbearable tension. Scout whined low in his throat, pressing against Elias's leg. Then the sky split open. It wasn't a distant crack of lightning, it was a blade of pure white heat that stabbed the spine of the ridge directly across the canyon. The flash was so violent it left a searing blue afterimage burned onto his retinas. For a full second, every needle on every pine tree was etched in stark black and white. The thunder that followed wasn't a rumble, it was a physical blow, a shock wave that rattled the windows of his cabin and shook the floorboards beneath his boots. Elias didn't flinch. He just watched the spot where the blade had struck. Nothing. 5 seconds. 10. Then, a single orange flower bloomed in the darkness of the pines. It was small, almost delicate, a pilot light. Then the wind, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. The flower became a bonfire. The bonfire became a roaring furnace. The fire didn't spread. It lunged. It devoured. Pushed by the hot, dry winds funneling down the canyon, the flames leaped from treetop to treetop in a terrifying crown fire, moving with a speed that defied logic. It sounded like a freight train, a monstrous, hungry roar that was growing louder with every passing second. He was watching a death sentence being carried out on the valley below. Inside the Aurora Lodge, the only storm was the clinking of ice in glasses and the swell of manufactured laughter. Richard Sterling was holding court by the fireplace, his face flushed with champagne and victory. The senator was nodding, impressed. As Richard pointed out the seamless integration of technology and nature. The entire perimeter is monitored, Richard boasted, gesturing vaguely towards the darkness outside. Thermal cameras, motion sensors. The power grid is backed by 2 military-grade diesel generators. This place is more secure than Fort Knox. The lights flickered. The soft jazz playing over the sound system stuttered and died. The laughter faltered, replaced by a murmur of confusion. Richard waved a dismissive hand. Small surge. The generators will kick in any second. Nothing to worry about. Sarah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to the party. She wasn't looking at the reflection of the worried guests. She was looking past it, at the ridge. It was glowing, a sickening, pulsating orange that painted the underside of the smoke-filled clouds. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pulled the small walkie-talkie Elias had told her to find from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the transmit button. A low hum started from outside, and the lights snapped back on. The music resumed. A nervous ripple of applause went through the room. Richard beamed, taking a small bow. See? State of the art. What did I tell you? But Sarah felt it. A vibration in the glass. The air that was being pumped into the hermetically sealed lodge suddenly tasted stale, thin. She saw a dusting of white fall on the pristine deck outside. Ash. She pushed through the crowd to her husband. Richard, look, she pleaded, pointing at the window. The whole mountain is on fire. He glanced, his expression one of pure annoyance. It's miles away. The fire department will handle it. Sarah, you're killing the mood. The senator is about to commit to a new round of funding. The road! Another guest, a woman in a sequined dress, shrieked from the other side of the room. Look at the road! Everyone turned. The single lane of asphalt that was their only way out was now illuminated by the inferno. And right in the middle of it, a giant Engelmann spruce, its trunk thick as a car, was engulfed in flames. It leaned, groaning, a pillar of fire before crashing down across the pavement with a sound like a giant's breaking bone. It blocked the road completely, a burning, impassable gate. The panic started then. Not as a scream, but as a sudden, deathly silence. The satellite phones were useless. No signal. The Wi-Fi was down. The high-tech bubble had popped. They were cut off. From his vantage point, Elias saw the tree fall. He saw the flicker of headlights as a security vehicle tried to drive out, then swerved to a halt before the wall of fire. He wasn't watching a party anymore. He was watching a tomb being sealed. The low hum of the generators outside the lodge began to change. The steady, confident rhythm faltered, becoming a strained, rhythmic coughing. Ash, thick as a blizzard, was pouring from the sky, a choking gray snowstorm. It was being sucked into the air intakes of the generators. The fortress was suffocating. Inside, the lights flickered again, this time with more violence. They strobed, casting terrifying, dancing shadows across the panicked faces of the guests. Richard was on his phone, yelling at his head of security, his voice cracking with the first notes of real fear. What do you mean you can't get a signal? Use the landline. It's dead, sir. The lines are down. The lights went out. This time they stayed out. The only light came from the hellscape outside, casting everyone in a demonic red glow. The humming of the generators sputtered, coughed one last pathetic time, and fell silent. The silence was heavier, more terrifying than the noise. The smart locks on the glass igloos and the main lodge doors engaged with a series of heavy, final kunks. The fail-safe protocol, designed to secure the property in a power outage, had just turned the five-star resort into a series of inescapable glass cages. In one of the guest pods, Lily pressed her face against the cool glass, her small hands flat against the pane. She could see the fire. It wasn't on the mountain anymore. It was here. It was a solid wall of roaring, incandescent rage, and it was coming for them. She turned to her mother, her eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. Sarah fumbled for the walkie-talkie in the dark, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She pressed the button. "Elias?" she whispered into the static, her voice a fragile thread in the roaring dark. "Elias, please, we're trapped. The doors won't open." Across the valley, in the quiet of his cabin, the static on Channel 9 crackled to life. Her desperate, terrified voice filled the room, small and tinny, like a message from a ghost. Elias stood, listening, the weight of the M14 in his hand a cold, hard promise. He looked from the rifle to the photograph of his lost crew on the mantelpiece, their smiling faces staring back at him from another lifetime. Then he looked back out the window, at the glowing glass prison where a little girl and her mother were about to be burned alive. The freight train was about to hit the station. The static hissed like a cornered snake. Then a voice, thin and torn apart by the storm of noise, cut through it. "Please, we're trapped. The doors won't open." Elias Thorne didn't move. He stood in the center of his cabin, a statue carved from shadow and regret, the heavy M14 rifle a cold anchor in his hand. The roar of the approaching fire was a physical pressure against the log walls, a constant, deep-throated growl that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. Outside, the world was ending in a symphony of cracking timber and screaming wind. Inside, there was only the sound of a woman's terror and the ticking of a grandfather clock that had long since stopped. He knew what she was talking about. Smart locks, fail, safes. The kind of high-tech garbage that Silicon Valley fools thought could tame a place like this. A fortress built by men who had never felt the savage, impartial judgment of the wild. Now their genius had turned their sanctuary into a kiln. He could leave. The thought was cold and clean, a sliver of ice in the furnace of the night. The goat trail that snaked up the back of his property, over the granite spine of the ridge, was clear. The wind was blowing the fire down the canyon, away from the high ground. He and Scout could be over the top and into the safety of the next valley in under an hour. He could survive. It's what he was good at. His eyes drifted from the rifle in his hand to the mantelpiece over the stone fireplace. There was a photograph there, tucked into a frame he carved himself from a piece of birch. It was 10 years old. The colors were faded, but the smiles were still bright. 20 men, himself included, grinning like idiots, covered in soot and sweat. Their faces were young, cocky, invincible. His boys. The Granite Peak hotshots. He didn't see the photo, he saw the aftermath. He smelled the ash and the cooked earth. He heard the sickening silence that comes after the roar, the silence where there should have been voices, laughter, the clink of tools. He felt the phantom heat on the scarred skin of his forearms. He had been the crew boss. Their lives had been his responsibility. He was the one who had made the call, the one who had survived. A ghost whispered in his ear, the same one that visited him every night. "You ran then too. You found the one spot the fire couldn't reach." He closed his eyes. The little girl's face appeared in the darkness. Lily, asking about his scars. Not with disgust, but with a child's unfiltered curiosity. He saw her small hand holding the old army compass he'd given her, her face serious as she listened to his instructions. Go to the water. Not the road. He had seen it in her eyes. The same thing he used to see in the eyes of his rookies. Awe. Trust. The belief that he was one of the men who walked into the fire when everyone else was running out. A hero. He had snorted at the thought then. He wasn't a hero, he was a relic. A ghost hiding from his own damn story. The walkie-talkie crackled again, but this time it was just static. The connection was gone. They were alone. He looked at the rifle again. The M14 was for fighting men, for poachers and cartel thugs. But the thing coming down the valley wasn't a man. It had no malice, no greed, it was just hungry. And you couldn't shoot hunger. With a resolve that settled deep in his bones, he leaned the rifle against the wall. Scout, who had been watching him with intelligent, worried eyes, gave a low whine and nudged his hand with his nose, as if to say, "What are we doing? We're going to work, boy," Elias said, his voice a rusty rasp. He crossed the room to an old, green military footlocker that sat at the base of his bed. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell that rose from it was the smell of his old life, old smoke, dried sweat, and the faint metallic tang of fear. He reached inside and pulled out a folded yellow shirt made of Nomex fabric. It was stained with soot that would never wash out. He pulled it on. It felt like a second skin. Then came the thick, reinforced pants, the worn leather of his lager boots, the scarred gloves. Each piece was a memory, a part of a ritual he thought he'd never perform again. He pulled out a tool. It was an axe on one side and a heavy adze for digging on the other. A Pulaski. To a firefighter, it was more than steel and wood. It was an extension of your will, the one thing that could carve life out of a landscape of death. He tested its weight, the familiar balance of cold comfort in his hands. Last, at the very bottom of the chest, was his helmet. It was the same shade of yellow, but its surface was a road map of hell. It was blackened, melted in spots, a deep gouge running along one side. On the front, the smokejumper logo was barely visible beneath the grime. He held it for a long moment, looking into its dark interior. He saw the faces of his crew reflected there. He heard their last shouts over the radio, swallowed by the roar. He had run from this helmet, from the man he was when he wore it. He had come to the loneliest place he could find to bury that man. But the fire had found him. It always did. He looked at the photograph one last time, at the smiling faces of the dead. He wasn't just saving the tech billionaire or his wife or their pampered guests. He was saving the girl. And maybe, just maybe, he was doing it for the 20 men who didn't get the chance to save anyone else. He settled the helmet on his head, the old padding molding to his skull like it was yesterday. He buckled the chin strap. The ghost in his ear fell silent. The man in the mirror was no longer a hermit. He was a hotshot again. "Not on my watch," he whispered to the ghost in the room. He grabbed a heavy canvas pack with his emergency fire shelter and a medical kit, slinging it over his shoulder. He whistled sharply. Scout was instantly at the door, tail low, ready. Elias strode to the cabin door and threw it open. The world outside was a hurricane of heat, ash, and sound. The air wasn't air anymore. It was a physical blow, a blast from an open furnace that stole the breath from his lungs. Embers the size of his fist rained down in a blinding, deadly blizzard. The forest he knew was gone, replaced by a writhing wall of incandescent orange that towered hundreds of feet into the night sky, turning the smoke-choked clouds a terrifying blood red. He didn't hesitate. He took one step over the threshold, the Pulaski held at his side. Scout pressed against his leg, a dark shadow in the flickering hell light. He was one man against an apocalypse, a ghost walking back into the flames he was born from. The first sound wasn't the roar of the fire, but the sharp crack of a hunting rifle. It was followed by the explosive pop of tempered glass shattering. A wall of the main lodge, the one facing the forest, ceased to exist. In its place stood 4 men, materializing from the smoke and ash like demons coughed up from the earth. They were not soldiers. They were gaunt, hard men, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes wide and feral with the animal terror of being hunted. They wore hunting camouflage that was singed and torn, and they carried rifles with the casual ease of men who used them for a living. The one in the lead, a wiry man with a face like dried leather, held his rifle low, sweeping it across the room. Panic erupted. The senator's aide screamed. A guest from California dropped a champagne flute, which shattered silently on the thick wool rug. Richard's head of security, a former police officer named Miller with a paunch and an ego, stepped forward, his hand on his holstered sidearm. "This is private property," Miller blustered, his voice a full octave higher than usual. "You are trespassing. Put down your weapons. Now." The leader didn't even look at him. He was scanning the room, his gaze lingering on the bar, the terrified staff, the open staircase leading to the private suites. He flicked his eyes to the man on his right, who moved with a brutal efficiency. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply closed the distance and drove the butt of his rifle into Miller's temple. The security chief crumpled like a cheap suit, his unfired pistol clattering to the floor. Silence fell, thick and choking, broken only by the hungry roar of the inferno outside. The heat was already pressing in, turning the air thick and hard to breathe. Richard stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture he must have seen in movies. Okay, take it easy," he said, his voice slick with a desperate attempt at control. "Whatever you want, you can have it." "Money? We have cash. Jewelry. Just tell me what you want." The leader finally focused on him, his eyes like chips of flint. "You the boss here?" "Yes, I'm Richard Sterling. I own this resort." Richard puffed out his chest slightly, a pathetic reflex of his usual authority. "I can help you. We can work something out." The man gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Work something out." He gestured with his rifle barrel towards the wall of fire visible through the broken window. "The world's on fire, tech boy, and your money can't buy a back door out of hell." He took a step closer, the smell of pine smoke and stale sweat rolling off him. "But you do have something I want." His eyes drifted past Richard, past the cowering guests, and settled on the helipad outside, the sleek lines of the Bell helicopter just visible through the swirling embers. "Keys," the man said, his voice flat. "For the bird. Now." Relief, pure and selfish, flooded Richard's face. It was just a machine, a replaceable asset. "Of course," he stammered, fumbling in the pocket of his designer jacket. "Yes, the keys. Here." He held them out, a peace offering. But the leader didn't take them. He just stared. "You think we can fly that thing through this crap? We ain't pilots. We're hunters." He nodded towards one of his men. "He can fly it, but not in this. We need to wait for a break in the wind, a lull." "So you'll wait here?" a guest whispered in horror. "We wait here," the leader confirmed. "And you all are going to be our insurance." Sarah pulled Lily behind her, her body a shield. She looked at Richard, her eyes pleading with him to do something, to be the strong man he always pretended to be. But that man was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, the heat intensified. The massive, floor-to-ceiling panoramic window that formed the far wall of the lodge began to make a sound, a low, deep groaning like a dying beast. A thin, black crack snaked its way up from the bottom corner. "This whole place is going to come down," one of the poachers muttered nervously, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Shut up," the leader snapped. It was then that Richard Sterling broke completely. He saw the cracking glass, he felt the suffocating heat, and he understood that waiting meant dying. His survival instinct, stripped of all morality and decency, took over. He took a shuffling step toward the leader, his hands still raised. "Wait," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You don't need all of them, they'll just slow you down." Sarah stared at her husband, a cold dread creeping into her heart. "Richard, what are you doing?" He ignored her. "I'll double whatever you think you can get for whatever you've been hunting," he babbled, his words tumbling over each other. $1 million, $2 million, wired to any account you want. Just get me and my family out. Take the helicopter. Take us with you. Leave the rest of them, please. The poachers stared at him. The guests stared at him. For a moment, the only sound was the fire. Sarah looked at the man she had married, the father of her child, and saw a stranger. A hollow thing wearing her husband's face. Lily, peering from behind her mother's legs, watched her father offer to sell every life in the room for his own. The poachers' leader looked from Richard's pathetic, pleading face to Sarah's look of utter contempt. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. He was enjoying this. He was watching a king tear the crown from his own head. "You leave all these fine folks to cook?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "For a man with so much, you ain't got a lot of spine." Crack. The sound was like a thunderclap inside the room. The panoramic window bowed inward, 1,000 new cracks racing across its surface like a spider's web woven in an instant. Smoke and ash billowed through the new fissures, and the heat became a physical blow, blistering the skin. The poachers flinched, raising their rifles. The guests screamed and scrambled back. "We gotta go now," one of the poachers yelled over the din. "To hell with the smoke, we go now." The leader knew he'd lost control of the timeline. They had to move. But he needed leverage. He needed something to guarantee his escape, something to keep the authorities at bay if they did manage to lift off. His flinty eyes scanned the chaos and landed on the one thing that radiated pure innocence. Lily. "Forget the money," he snarled, his brief moment of amusement gone, replaced by cold, brutal pragmatism. He pointed a dirty finger directly at the little girl cowering behind her mother. "We'll take the girl instead." Before Sarah could react, before she could even scream, the man closest to her lunged. A rough, calloused hand shot out, grabbing Lily's thin arm and yanking her out from behind her mother's protection. Sarah's scream was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of tearing, of a part of her soul being ripped away. The poacher's hand, grimed with dirt and ash, closed around Lily's arm. He yanked her forward, and the little girl stumbled, her small cry swallowed by the roar of the fire. She was a doll in the grip of a monster. The man began dragging her toward the shattered main entrance, using her small body as a shield. Richard stood frozen, his mouth agape, the offer to trade his guests for his own life still hanging poisoned in the air. He watched his daughter being stolen and did nothing. His mind, so brilliant at calculating risk and reward, simply shut down. This variable was not on his spreadsheet. Sarah, however, was pure instinct. She launched herself forward, nails bared, a she-bear defending her cub. But a second poacher stepped into her path, leveling his rifle at her chest. He didn't even have to say anything. The cold black circle of the muzzle stopped her dead. The leader, holding Lily, gave a vicious grin. "That's better," he sneered, backing toward the exit. "Now, nobody follows, or the girl gets." He never finished the sentence. Something dark and fast shot out of the thickest part of the smoke billowing in from the broken window. It wasn't a bullet. It was 120 pounds of fur and fury. Scout hit the second poacher, the one holding Sarah at bay, at full speed. The man grunted as teeth sank into the thigh of his right leg. He stumbled back, his rifle firing uselessly into the high, vaulted ceiling, bringing down a shower of plaster and dust. In the second of stunned silence that followed, a figure emerged from the smoke. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like something born of the fire itself. He wore an old, scorched yellow Nomex shirt, the faded letters ex-smokejumper, barely visible across the back. His face was a mask of soot and grim determination, his eyes burning brighter than the embers outside. In his hands he held not a rifle, but a Pulaski, a firefighter's axe, a brutal tool for a brutal job. It was Elias. He moved with an unnatural speed, not at the leader, but at the third poacher who was turning to help his friend with the dog. Elias didn't swing the axe blade. He swung the tool like a club, the heavy steel head connecting with the man's knee with a sickening wet crunch. The man screamed and went down, one down. The leader, still gripping Lily, stared in disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" he yelled over the noise. Elias didn't answer. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. Scout released his hold and darted back to his side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The poacher Scout had bitten was now trying to bring his rifle around, his leg bleeding freely, but Elias was already moving. He kicked over a heavy oak table, sending it sliding across the polished floor. It slammed into the man's injured leg, pinning him against a support pillar. 2 down. Now it was just the leader. He stood framed against the doorway, a wall of flame roaring behind him. He tightened his grip on Lily, pressing the cold muzzle of his rifle against her temple. Lily whimpered, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "Stay back," the leader shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "I'll do it. I swear to God, I'll kill her." Richard finally found his voice. "Don't, please, let her go," he begged, his words weak and useless. Elias stopped. He stood 10 feet away, the Pulaski held loosely in one hand. He and the poacher were locked in a stalemate, with the little girl's life as the prize. The heat from the fire was immense now, blistering paint off the walls. The air was turning to poison. "Let the girl go," Elias said, his voice calm and low, yet it carried over the inferno. "You have no way out. The fire's taken the whole valley." "Liar!" the leader screamed. "The chopper!" "We can still make it." He started backing away again, dragging Lily with him. Elias took one slow step forward. "That wind is shifting. Your blades will melt before you get 100 feet up. You'll die." For a split second, the leader hesitated. He glanced up at the smoke swirling outside, his mind trying to process the new information. It was the only opening Elias would get. He didn't charge. He didn't throw his axe. He did something no one expected. He turned his gaze from the poacher and looked directly at Lily. "Lily," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Bear." The girl's eyes widened. She understood. It was the lesson from the forest. Don't run. Make yourself big. As the poacher dragged her backward over the threshold, Lily did exactly what Elias had taught her. She stopped fighting, went limp for a single beat, and then, with all the strength in her small body, she stomped down hard on the poacher's instep. The man roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Elias moved. He crossed the 10 feet of floor in 3 long strides. The poacher tried to bring his rifle back to bear, but Elias was already on him. He didn't strike him. He drove his shoulder hard into the man's chest, wrapping his arms around him and Lily, shielding the girl with his own body. They crashed to the ground together, a tangle of limbs, just outside the lodge on the stone patio. The poacher's rifle flew from his grasp, skittering across the hot stone. Sarah ran forward, screaming Lily's name. Elias rolled clear, pushing Lily toward her mother. "Get her!" he yelled. Sarah scooped her daughter up, holding her tight. Elias rose to his feet over the downed poacher. He picked up the Pulaski. For a moment he stood there, the angel of judgment silhouetted against the flames. But he didn't bring the axe down. Instead, he looked back into the lodge, at Richard, who was staring, paralyzed, at the 2 other injured poachers, at the terrified guests. "This way, everybody, now!" Elias commanded, his voice the unquestionable authority of a man who had walked through hell before. "The whole roof is coming down." He didn't lead them toward the fire. He ran back inside, past the bar, and kicked open a door marked staff only. He led them down a short, dark hallway to a heavy steel cellar door used for deliveries. He wrenched it open, revealing a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. "Go!" "It leads out to the marsh behind the lodge." "Move!" People scrambled, pushing and shoving. Sarah went first, clutching Lily. The guests followed, their 5-star civility burned away, replaced by raw survival instinct. Richard was among the last, his eyes wide with shock and shame. Elias waited, his eyes scanning the burning room, making sure no one was left behind. He saw the security chief, Miller, groaning on the floor. He ran back, grabbed the big man under the arms, and began dragging him toward the cellar. Above them, a massive timber beam, eaten through by the fire, groaned one last time. With a deafening crack, it snapped. The entire roof began to collapse inward in a cascade of fire and splintered wood. Elias threw himself and the unconscious security chief down the stairs just as the main lodge imploded, a fireball roaring through the space where they had been standing a second before. He slammed the heavy steel door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness, the sound of the world ending muffled behind the thick metal. For a moment, there was only the sound of panicked breathing in the pitch black. Then, a click. A beam of light from Elias's headlamp cut through the gloom. They were in a damp, narrow, concrete tunnel, the air thick with the smell of earth and mildew. He scanned the faces of the survivors huddled in the narrow passage. Sarah, holding Lily. Richard, shaking. A handful of guests and staff. They were alive. They were safe from the collapsing building. "We follow this to the end," Elias said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "It will let us out in the reeds by the creek. The fire won't burn there. We just have to." A low rumble started, deeper than the fire. It wasn't coming from behind them, but from ahead. The concrete floor beneath their feet began to vibrate. The rumbling grew louder, closer, turning into a deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains. Elias's face tightened. He knew that sound. It wasn't fire. It was worse. He pushed past the terrified group and ran to the far end of the tunnel. to the heavy steel door that led to the outside. He put his shoulder to it and heaved it open just a crack. He didn't need to see. The blast of superheated air and the sheer deafening noise told him everything. He stumbled back, his face grim. Sarah looked at him, her eyes asking the question she was too terrified to speak. "The firestorm," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's created its own weather. The wind is sucking all the oxygen out of the valley." He looked at the small group, at the single, narrow tunnel that was their only hope. "We've traded a glass trap for a concrete coffin. We can't go forward, and we can't go back." The roar did not stop. It became the world. Inside the concrete tunnel, the sound was a physical force, vibrating through their bones, shaking dust from the ceiling. The air, already thin, grew hot and metallic. Richard Sterling was curled into a ball on the floor, making small, whimpering sounds that were swallowed by the noise. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a terrified animal in a burrow waiting for the sky to fall. Elias stood by the heavy steel door, his hand pressed against it, feeling the impossible heat radiating through the metal. He was a statue in the chaos, his face unreadable in the intermittent flashes of his headlamp. Lily was buried in Sarah's arms, her face hidden, her small body trembling. Sarah wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Elias, holding on to his stillness as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. Then, as slowly as it had begun, the roar started to recede. The freight train sound pulled away, fading into a deep, guttural rumble, then a whisper, then silence. An absolute, ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. The heat against the door began to lessen. Elias waited. He counted 60 seconds in his head, a lifetime of quiet. He looked back at the small, huddled group. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden stillness. He put his shoulder to the door and heaved. It groaned open, letting in a sliver of gray light and the smell of a cremated world. The world was gone. In its place was a kingdom of ash. Everything. The sky, the ground, the skeletal remains of 100-year-old pines was coated in a thick gray powder. Ash fell from the sky not like snow, but like a final, silent curse. The Aurora Lodge was a blackened skeleton. Its glass domes melted into grotesque, weeping shapes. From the distance came a new sound, a rhythmic whump, whump, whump. A pair of Black Hawk helicopters descended through the smoky haze, their rotors kicking up swirling gray tornadoes. Men in fatigues began to rappel down, moving with grim efficiency. On the horizon, a massive DC-10 tanker painted a long red line of fire retardant against the smoldering ridge, a final punctuation mark on the disaster. The survivors stumbled out of the tunnel, blinking in the monochrome light. They looked like ghosts emerging from a tomb. Richard saw the soldiers, the helicopters, the official presence, and something flickered back to life in his eyes. Authority. He strode forward, trying to puff out his chest, his soot-stained polo shirt clinging to his frame. "I'm Richard Sterling," he announced to the first soldier he saw, a grim-faced National Guard captain. "This is my property. I need a satellite phone and an immediate medevac for my family." The captain didn't even slow down. He looked Richard up and down with an expression of complete indifference. "Right now, sir, this is a federal disaster zone. You're a civilian. Stay with the others." He pointed toward a makeshift triage area being set up near the smoldering helipad. "Do you know who I am?" Richard sputtered, his voice cracking. Before the captain could answer, another voice cut in. It was Miller, the security chief Elias had dragged to safety. He was leaning against a blackened rock, a medic wrapping a bandage around his head. "I know who you are," Miller said, his voice thick with contempt. "You're the man who offered to trade all our lives for a seat on your helicopter." A handful of the rescued guests standing nearby turned to stare at Richard. Their faces were masks of shock, then disgust. The story spread through the small group of survivors like a contagion. Whispers turned to glares. People physically stepped away from him, creating a circle of shame. Richard's face went from indignant red to chalky white. He looked to Sarah for support, but she just stared at him, her expression hollow. She wasn't angry. She looked like a woman seeing a stranger for the first time. He was alone, utterly and completely, standing in the ruins of his five-star dream. Elias had stayed back, trying to blend into the background. He was checking on Scout, running his hands through the dog's ash-caked fur when a paramedic approached him. "Sir, you've got some nasty burns on that arm. Let me take a look." Elias nodded, sitting down heavily on the bumper of a newly arrived fire engine. As the medic began cleaning the wound, a man in a fire captain's uniform walked by, barking orders into a radio. He stopped, glanced at Elias, and then took a half step back, his eyes narrowing. "Hey, I know you," the captain said, pointing a finger. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. Arizona, 2013, the Yarnell Hill fire. Elias said nothing, just stared at the gray ground. The captain walked closer, his boots crunching in the ash. He peered at the scars on Elias's face, the ones barely visible under the soot. A look of stunned recognition dawned on his face. "My God," he whispered, lowering his radio. "Thorn. Elias Thorne, you were the hotshot crew boss, Granite Mountain. The captain's voice dropped, full of a reverence and sorrow that turned heads. We lost 19 men that day. We thought, he shook his head in disbelief. They pulled 3 bodies out of that shelter deployment zone. We thought you were the 4th. Your name is on the monument. You're a ghost, son. Elias finally looked up, his eyes meeting the captain's. For a moment, the mask of the hermit, the recluse, fell away, and in his eyes was the haunted look of a man who had walked out of a tomb and never stopped walking. I got lucky, Elias said, his voice raspy. Or unlucky. Depends on the day. The captain just stood there speechless, staring at the legend he thought was dead. The word began to ripple through the assembled first responders. That's Thorne, the sole survivor. Elias ignored the stares. He felt a small presence beside him. He looked down and saw Lily. Her face was clean now, wiped by a medic, but her eyes were old. She didn't say a word. She just climbed up onto the bumper and sat beside him, her small frame not quite touching his. After a moment, she leaned over and rested her head on his good shoulder. A simple, profound act of trust. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, a broken monument of a man, and let her. Across the ruined landscape, Sarah watched them, her arms wrapped around herself. She caught Elias's eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't just thanks. It was an apology. An understanding. A promise. Richard stood 100 feet away from all of them, a solitary figure against the smoke, his phone to his ear, probably trying to call a lawyer, his voice lost in the wind. Hours later, after the statements had been given and the surviving poachers had been led away in cuffs, Elias was finally cleared to leave. He whistled for Scout, and together they started the long walk up the trail, away from the noise and the wreckage. The path to his home was an island of life in a sea of death. The firebreak he had painstakingly dug had held. The flames had licked at the edges of his property, charring the fence posts, but they had not breached it. His small, defiant world had survived. He reached his gate. The hand-painted sign that read "No trespassing" was gone, likely burned away. He pushed the gate open. It swung without a sound. He didn't bother to close it behind him. He and Scout walked up to the cabin. Elias sank onto the top step of his porch, the old wood groaning under his weight. He was exhausted, every muscle aching, his skin tight from the heat and the burns. Scout rested his head on Elias's knee, letting out a long sigh. Above them, the American flag still hung from its pole. The edges were blackened and frayed, a piece of the fabric burned clean through, leaving a small, jagged hole in one of the white stripes. But it still held. It billowed softly in the smoky breeze, a tattered, defiant banner against a gray sky. He was no longer a ghost. He was just a man, home from a long, long war. And for the first time in a decade, his gate was open.